Hi, everybody. I'm going to give a little bit of a background on the firm. Thompson Coburn is a full-service law firm with about 400 lawyers in several offices in Chicago, Los Angeles, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. Aaron's expertise is around the regulation of higher education, and my expertise is around the policy of higher education. In Aaron's practice, he provides regulatory counsel on federal, state, and accrediting agency laws and standards. He represents institutions in postsecondary mergers and acquisitions, contract drafting and negotiation, student and employee litigation, government investigations, administrative proceedings, audits, and reviews. Through my practice, which is government relations and lobbying and policy, we assist postsecondary institutions and organizations, including trade associations, technology companies, and the like, to design and implement education policy initiatives, provide introductions, and build supporting coalitions. While Aaron and I are the backbone of the education practice here at the firm, we also do a number of other things, including public bond finance, healthcare, labor and employment law, immigration, and most recently we've been doing a lot of work on drones and FAA matters. So we have a real depth and breadth to our practice, and we can fully service educational institutions and organizations. This slide is Aaron's, a little summary of Aaron's CV. He started at a prior firm with us here in DC, and then he moved back to St. Louis, where he was Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Vatterott Educational Centers. My slide is next. I'm a founding partner of our lobbying and policy group, and we do essentially everything you could possibly need to do in policy related to both K-12 and higher education. And with that, I'll turn it back to Aaron, and you'll be hearing from me in just a little bit.
Thanks, Chris. So before I jump into the presentation proper, just very briefly, I wanted to mention there are some competency-based education resources. We're going to send out after the webinar we wrote a paper, the American Enterprise Institute commissioned a series of, I think it was 5 papers total, on various aspects of competency-based education. They were all released back in the spring. Some of them looked at outcomes, some of them looked at the different types of institutions that are engaging in competency-based education and the way they're trying to develop the programs. I think there was one paper that focused on employers and sort of their sense of the role of competency-based ed. Our paper in the series talked about the regulation of competency-based education and sort of where it is and where it might be going. And as you would expect, that is one reason that this presentation focuses on that aspect of competency-based ed. So we're going to circulate the paper along with a couple of additional documents that we'll mention that have been released by some of the accreditors and the Department of Education. We'll put that all in one PDF package and send it to you. Just so you have it as a resource. A couple other things I'll mention. We do a blog, Regulation, which is our higher education law and policy blog. It's on our website. If you Google Regulation, it'll pop right up. And we cover a lot of different topics in higher ed, including at times competency-based education and some other things. And we tweet and all that kind of great stuff. And then the government relations group, Chris's group, also does a really nice monthly piece called Oncology that they can email to you if you have any interest. Shoot us a line and we'll put you on the distribution list. And every month they talk about some aspect of government relations and policy development and cover a lot of the nomenclature and the things in that world that are a little bit arcane to the rest of us. Is that a fair description, Chris? I don't know if I did one.
I think that's perfect. I mean, we try to break down a word that you're hearing in the news, either lately or we know that you will hear in the news. Break it down for you so you understand a little bit of its history and how it works in common practice. You know, one of our first ones was during a negotiated rulemaking, and we did a little bit of the history of neg-reg and how that works. And a lot of folks hear the term neg-reg all the time, but I don't think they're familiar with, how it works throughout the federal government and how we got to the negotiated rulemaking process versus the traditional notice and comment process.
Yeah, so it's a great feature, and it gets very positive feedback. So if you're interested, just let us know. All right, so enough of the preliminary. Let's jump into the meat and potatoes. Here's our presentation outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about CBE fundamentals. A lot of the challenge of competency-based education and the regulation of competency-based ed is just understanding what the heck the concept means, right, and how to divvy up the different types of CBE that are out there. So I want to take a minute to talk about that, help get us all on the same page. That'll also provide context for the remainder of the presentation. Then I'm going to jump into some of the nuts and bolts of the current post-secondary regulatory framework. And so, in other words, I want to talk a little bit about how the different regulators that form the triad, and those in the higher ed community will know that I mean the states, the accreditors, and the Department of Education, how they are trying to accommodate and advance competency-based ed. And then finally, Chris is going to talk a great deal about sort of our thoughts and reflections and recommendations that came out of our research based on, you know, this current landscape, and also look ahead a little bit and give you some insight into the Beltway. His crystal ball is quite good. So CBE fundamentals. It's important to understand how competency-based education differs from good old-fashioned traditional programming. So traditional programming, right, to graduate, students must successfully earn a specified number of credit hours, typically. I understand there are a handful of institutions that for many years have done things a little bit differently, but the vast majority are built on credit hour systems. And to earn those credit hours, you typically have to attend courses over a fixed period of time, so during an academic term, and that could be a quarter or a semester, but there's a defined period during which you're taking classes. You have to complete required assignments and tests, and then you have to receive a passing grade. And if you do those things successfully, you get credit. Key features of traditional programming that are important to understand because they will be distinct from competency-based ed. Programming and student progress are tied to the instructional hour, right? So students start at a specific time, they attend classes at specific times, they end at a specific time. And you have to be there for that duration, or at least for a certain amount of that duration, and actually be sitting in the seat. And even in the online context, traditional online programming still often is tied to the credit hour, and you still have folks who have to log certain amounts of time and complete evidence that they've been involved for certain amounts of time, right? Advancement does not require mastery of subject matter or specified knowledge or skills. And then finally, students may retain different combinations of knowledge and skills and demonstrate different levels of proficiency. So what I mean by those last two bullets. So, you know, a student can go through a course and they may have a clinical proficiency, and they don't have to show that they've mastered it. They only have to show that they have learned enough of it that they can accomplish a passing grade, right? So someone doesn't have to master that clinical segment or master the lecture segment, right, the didactic segment of the programming necessarily to pass and get the credit. They just have to be, you know, perform sufficiently so that they pass the class. And what I mean by students can retain different combinations of knowledge and skills. So one student, right, could be really good at the clinical portion and okay at the lecture, and they might get an A in one and a B in the other, right, and end up with a B+ in the class. And another student could have the exact opposite. They might really do well on the written test, not so well on the clinical. And you could have both of these students who pass the class, both who have identical grades, but they actually had different levels and combinations of knowledge and skill and proficiency, right? So they don't both know all the same things, and they aren't equally qualified to do all of those things. So how is competency-based education different? So competency-based programs, you define core competencies, right? So we say we've got a program, and for someone, if they're going to go through this program and graduate, they're going to have to, this program has these various competencies, and that's what builds the program. And then you assess a student's mastery of each competency. To complete the program, then, students have to demonstrate mastery, or at least some level of proficiency of all the competencies. So competency-based ed programs focus on direct measurement of the student's knowledge and skills. And at least in theory, if you had two students going through a CBE program, when they graduated, you could look at their transcript if it was written, you know, to show competencies, and you would know these two individuals have both demonstrated a same level of mastery and the same level of knowledge and skills. You can see how that's different from the traditional programming. Now, there is a lot of diversity among competency-based education programs. They certainly don't look the same. The location and provision of resources can vary. So, some institutions may actually provide all of the resources. Their faculty may write the books. They may provide the knowledge through lecture. But theoretically, another competency-based ed program might just direct students to existing resources, and those resources may or may not be provided by the institution, right? The form and method of assessments can differ greatly. Some institutions have tests that they've developed. Some look at portfolios. Students have to complete projects. Some may have a combination of the two. So what the student is actually doing to demonstrate their skill and proficiency can differ, and how institutions go about devising and assessing that proficiency can differ greatly. I mentioned earlier, a lot of times people in the context of competency-based ed will talk about mastery, but the level of proficiency can vary as well. You don't necessarily have to hold students to the standard of mastery. You could have a lesser level of proficiency if you wanted to. Learning modality, meaning that competency-based ed can be on the ground or online. We tend to think of it a lot as an online concept, and in a lot of the national conversation, it's thought of as an online concept, but it certainly does not have to be. And then whether the program is tied to the credit hour or the academic term. So it is possible, you can have a competency-based education program, meaning a program that is built upon competencies that have been identified and students advance by assessing competencies, but they're still awarded credit based on their success, and it still takes place during a fixed academic term. There is a subset of competency-based education that the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, has referred to as direct assessment. And they've more or less coined this term, and it's now sort of filtered its way down so that everyone is largely using it, the accreditors, and I expect over time states and others will use it as well. And it's built entirely on the, quote, direct assessment of student knowledge and skill. And what's important to understand is direct assessment programs, which again are under the broader umbrella of competency-based education, are divorced entirely from the credit hour or the academic term concept. So students can start and stop at any point in time. They progress at their own pace, and they are not awarded any type of credit when they demonstrate competencies. You literally advance through the program by demonstrating mastery of each competency, and you complete the program when you have demonstrated mastery of all the competencies of which the program consists. Direct assessment, the distinction between competency-based ed in general and direct assessment is important for the remainder of our presentation for any conversation about the regulation of competency-based ed, because typically competency-based programs that still tie to the credit hour and are built on the credit hour can largely fit into the current regulatory framework that exists and has existed for 100 years, right? All those laws and standards out there that revolve around credit hours, they work. But direct assessment programs, because they don't have any connection to the credit hour, often create significant regulatory heartburn, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So, navigating the current post-secondary regulatory framework. This is a slide pops up in a lot of our presentations. This is the triad. If you want to get a competency-based education approved or a direct assessment program approved, and you want Title IV funding for students who participate in that program, you're going to have to get approval from all three members of the triad. Typically, if you're a public institution, it's possible you might not have any type of state-level approval that you would need to acquire, but certainly most private institutions would. And then everyone is going to have to deal with their accreditor in the Department of Education. So what we wanted to talk about was, and this is how the remainder of this section of the presentation is organized, how are each of these individual sections of the triad dealing with competency-based ed? So we'll start with the state. States do a lot, right? Home states, meaning the state in which an institution is organized or chartered. They authorize the institution to operate and to grant post-secondary credentials, so that authority to grant degrees is actually vested by the state. Foreign states may recognize distance education. So, if you're in a home state and you are beaming your education over into another state, that state may also authorize you to do that and to educate its residents. and state professional boards. So even beyond the main state licensing entities, you have lots of state professional boards that regulate certain types of programs and professions, and nursing and education programs are really good examples. So the states are very involved in the regulation of post-secondary programming, obviously. State policymakers face significant challenges when it comes to the regulation of competency-based ed, and in particular direct assessment programming. And this is because it's very different. Direct assessment programming in particular is very different from anything that they've ever regulated or approved previously, at least the kind of direct assessment program that is being thought of and offered right now by mainstream institutions. And the other problem is that a lot of the state regulators aren't as educated, right? I mean, they're about competency-based education. They have lots of other things they think about. There are many more of them than there are accreditors or persons at the Department of Education thinking about this. So there's an informational challenge there too. How do you get every state legislature in the United States up to speed on direct assessment programming? Many of the state regulatory frameworks for both public and private institutions, and typically they are separate. So you have the public entities that have been chartered by the state, and there's a set of laws that govern them, and then you'll have a separate set of laws that provide for the authorization of private entities and govern their operation. Both of those frameworks in almost every state are inextricably linked to the credit hour and the concepts of instructional time, and as I mentioned previously, have been forever. And just some examples. So maximum and minimum credit hour requirements for academic degree levels. There are many states that literally say our community colleges, their associate degrees have to have at least this many credit hours and no more than this many credit hours. Well, if you have a program that doesn't have credit hours, it becomes very hard to know whether or not you satisfy that requirement. Laws relating to withdrawals, refunds, academic progress, all are built on the notion of credit hours and instructional time, as are often methodologies for calculating graduation rates, right? Because you're talking about students who started at a particular point in time and were in a certain cohort and completed and then graduated at a certain point. And when you talk about programs that aren't tied to any concept of the academic term, it becomes very hard to figure out how to develop graduation rates for that type of programming. Provisions relating to enrollment, financing documentation, academic catalogs, consumer information disclosures, all of those things often tie to credit hours and require those key concepts of credit hour, instructional weeks, and terms be defined. So when they're absent, those provisions become very challenging. And then, of course, professional licensure criteria and criteria for program approval often are tied to credit hour standards. So, for example, you'll run into a situation where in a state they'll say if you want to serve as a superintendent in the public schools here, you have to demonstrate that you've had this many credit hours of instruction in general education, this many in this time, in pedagogy, this many. Again, if you graduated from a direct assessment program, how do you demonstrate that you satisfy these credit hour thresholds? So states some of them are dealing with this. The truth of the matter is, of the three members of the triad, the states seem to be the farthest behind. We're only aware of one or two that have really made any effort to revise their general statutes and regulations that deal with the authorization of post-secondary education to accommodate direct assessment programming. Now, I want to note, there are states that have taken steps to authorize specific institutions, either an institution that's designed entirely to deliver direct assessment programming. So Kentucky's working on that right now, Wisconsin. There are states that have taken steps to accommodate competency-based ed offered by other institutions. Western Governors is a classic example of an institution that offers competency-based ed, and a lot of states have modified their laws so that students of Western Governors can access state funding, which often is state funding systems and allocations and programs are based on credit hour concepts. But that's different from looking generally at the state authorization laws that govern all those private institutions, or looking at those laws that govern all your public institutions and that are linked to the credit hour and saying, how do we need to modify these to accommodate direct assessment programming? And very few states have taken any steps to do that. Others, rather than trying to modify, have simply been trying to fit the square peg in the round hole, so to speak. So they've taken direct assessment programs and they've tried to work out an equivalency so they could try to approve them or measure them against those standards that incorporate the credit hour. But this raises a lot of issues, and some of them are here on the slide. Does the state have authority to sanction any kind of equivalency? What kind of conversion methodologies are acceptable, right? So if you're a school in that state and you want to get your direct assessment program approved, how are you supposed to know how the state's going about assigning credit hours to direct assessment programs? And it also raises a real question about whether varying methodologies will result in the inconsistent application of the law. In other words, if a state's looking at one institution's program and then another, and there are no standards or guidelines, and they're essentially just working out equivalencies, ad hoc along the way, it starts to raise questions about whether things are being managed in a consistent manner. Certainly that type of approach, if CBE really takes off and you've got lots of institutions offering these kinds of programs and direct assessment programs and wanting to seek approval, ad hoc approval processes are not going to work. A small but growing number of states I mentioned earlier have taken steps to create competency-based programming within existing institutions, but again, few have revised state authorization laws. And a similar story with regard to state professional licensure. It is worth noting just briefly that there are some state systems that already are flexible enough to accommodate direct assessment. I have Iowa as an example of a state that does not, with regard to private institutions, does not specifically approve programs. So there, if you have a program that's direct assessment, it's not as much of an issue simply because the state doesn't review your program in that way. And there are some states that have exemption, either institutional or program exemptions, based on how long you've been around, how your ownership structure, things like that. And you may, as a consequence, be exempt from their oversight, so that you would be able to launch a direct assessment program. But again, that's not because those systems have been devised or revised to manage direct assessment. It's just because they either don't review programs or they're already flexible enough in the way they were originally created to accommodate direct assessment programming, and there aren't that many of those out there. The other thing that is happening right now that's really beneficial to competency-based education is the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement Initiative, or the SARA initiative. Those familiar with SARA will know the idea is traditionally, if you launched an online institution and you wanted to beam it into 49 states, there was at least the possibility that you would have to get authorized in all 49 states, other than your home state, depending on the nature of your program. And that obviously was a tremendous obstacle. I mean, Chris and I both have worked with institutions in the past to help them get authorized in multiple states across the country. And a lot of people understood that this was a problem, inefficient, costly for institutions of higher ed, a real barrier to innovation and programming. So the whole point of this initiative is to get a lot of states to sign up to this reciprocity concept, so that if I'm a school in my home state, and my home state participates in this initiative, and I get approved to participate in the initiative, then I can beam my programming into any other state that participates in SARA, and I don't have to be specifically licensed by that state, right? Well, the good news is lots and lots of states and their legislatures have been taking action to join. I think it's over 50% at this point, which has exceeded expectations. And what that means is, theoretically, if your home state now will take steps to accommodate direct assessment programming, for example, then now you can beam your direct assessment program into every other state participating in SARA, right, regardless of whether they've managed to revise their laws, right, because you only have to concern yourself with the laws of your home state. So SARA, it wasn't, designed to accommodate competency-based ed, but generally it will potentially enhance innovation, direct assessment being one of those types of innovations, insofar as it opens up the door for institutions. Moving on to accreditation of competency-based education. So accreditors, for those on the phone who may not be as familiar, just generally they focus on the quality and integrity of an institution's programming and operations. Of the members of the triad, they arguably look the hardest, the deepest, and even the broadest at what an institution is really doing, right, and the quality of its academic offerings. They expect their member institutions to adhere to a really comprehensive set of accreditation standards that cover almost every aspect of the school's operations. And most accreditors require, among other things, annual reporting, and they conduct periodic in-depth compliance reviews. So they're a really important part of the triad. They're very educated with regard to programming and higher education concepts, and their objective, unlike the states that primarily are thinking about consumer protection, and unlike the feds who are most concerned with the dollar, accreditors really are about the quality and integrity of the academic operations. So they're very interested in competency-based education direct assessment. The CBE approval process from one accreditor to the next is varied. Some have developed processes for evaluating direct assessment programming. Middle States is a great example. They're a regional accreditor. They've created a really robust set of criteria and processes specifically for the evaluation of direct assessment learning, including they've got some webinars, they've got templates and forms, all that kind of great stuff. On the side of the national accreditors, ACICS, which I think may be the largest national accreditor these days, just put out a new framework effective July 1 of this year, which has a two-part process. It includes at least a couple of monitoring on-site visits, so it's also a very robust process. But on the other side of the spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, there are also some accreditors, including regionals, and certainly among the nationals, that don't have any custom process yet for the evaluation of direct assessment programming. Now, that is not to say they don't have a way of evaluating direct assessment programming, only that they don't have any particular materials or processes that are designed just to accommodate direct assessment. So if you call them with a direct assessment program, they're just going to have to fit you into their standard process. The problem then is that without any sort of guidance or materials specific to direct assessment, it leaves member institutions without guidance on critical concepts like, what does my accreditor consider to be a direct assessment program? How do they define it? What constitutes an acceptable conversion methodology? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things accreditors have to do is to think about, if you want this program to get Title IV approval, even if it's a direct assessment program, how you would convert it to credit hours. And they have to look at that and make sure that they're comfortable with that conversion methodology. And then there are other critical questions as well. Among the challenges that accreditors have faced, one has been a real struggle with lack of experience. There are very few organizations, sort of categorically speaking, that have more experience in depth than accreditors when it comes to higher education. I mean, not only do the staff members often have long careers in higher ed, but they can draw upon the expertise of their member institutions. So now you're looking at, tens, 20s, hundreds of institutions and all their professionals who can participate on site visit teams and things like that, and who have great depth and understanding of how post-secondary ed works. But direct assessment is so new and so different that even accreditors have had very few people on staff or that they could draw upon in their membership communities who really have depth and understanding when it comes to this type of programming, which makes it difficult for them to manage and monitor the programming. The president of the SACS last year, there was an Inside Higher Ed article where Bill Whelan was quoted saying, look, direct assessment programs are novel for accreditors just like they are for everybody else. The other thing that's surprising is that at least up until just the last 2 or 3 months, the number of institutions that were actually developed on record as developing and seeking approval of direct assessment programs was very small. There's been a lot of conversation nationally and a lot of interest in this kind of programming. But when you're accredited and you're trying to gain experience going through these processes, the way you do that is you have lots of people apply and you just work through it. And if you've only got a handful of people actually applying, that doesn't give you a lot of data points, right, when you're trying to learn and develop new processes for moving forward. Now, the president of HLC, actually, is another great quote from Inside Higher Ed. The Higher Learning Commission has received relatively few solid requests for direct assessment programming. Many of the applications are still tied in some way to the credit hour and don't qualify as direct assessment, right? So that was I think late last year. Now, the interesting thing is things are changing, and they are changing rapidly. Public agenda, some of you may know, if you're on this webinar, you're probably interested in competency-based education. So you're probably aware there's a big conference coming up, CBE Exchange or CBE Exchange, I'm not sure how it's supposed to be said, in publicizing, and this is for academics primarily. The whole conference is focused on competency-based ed, but the idea is that it's a forum for academics and folks at institutions for higher education to come together, trade ideas, and understand what everybody's doing. They claim in their sort of promotional materials and in the prep for this conference, which I think is next month, that there are 600 institutions now in the design phase for a new CBE program, or actively creating one, or already have a program in place. Now that's CBE in general, not just direct assessment. That's the bigger umbrella. But still, you know, using that same standard, the understanding is that that's up from about 50 at this time last year. So that gives you a sense of how, you know, the conversation around competency-based ed has been building now for 2 or 3 years, but the momentum on the institution side seems to really have taken off just in the last 6 months or so. A couple other really important things also happened in June. One, CRAC, which is the Council of Regional Accrediting Commission, so all the regionals are members of CRAC. On June 2nd, they released what they call a framing statement, which provides guidance to their accreditors, so to the regionals, on how the regionals should go about evaluating competency-based ed. And it's useful. It's only 2 or 3 pages, right? But prior to this document coming out, there was really nothing in this space. And in these 2 or 3 pages, the CRAC statement provides some clarity as to, you know, how the distinction between competency-based in general and what direct assessment means, and how you would think about or define a hybrid program. And that would be a program that maybe part of it is delivered in a traditional credit hour format, and then part of it has a direct assessment or competency-based component. Also, importantly, the CRAC statement offered some parameters for how regional accreditors should go about approving these different types of programming. And so specifically, it said regionals should approve an institution's first CBE program as a substantive change, right? They should approve each direct assessment program as a substantive change, or make it go through a substantive change process. And that's actually required under current federal laws that govern accreditors. And this is a really important distinction, and it's one that is significant for a lot of regionally accredited schools. So what that means is the first time that you propose a competency-based education program, if it's not direct assessment, just competency-based in general, then you're going to go through a substantive change process. But subsequently, if you roll out additional programs of that sort, you may not have to go through that substantive change process again. It depends on the accreditor, but certainly the door is open that you wouldn't have to repeat it. You've established your first CBE program, you've gone through the review, and the accreditor presumably has a level of comfort with you rolling out additional programs. But under these standards, and as we'll see in a minute under federal law, every time an institution rolls out a direct assessment program, that specific program is going to have to be approved through a substantive change process. That's a big difference for a lot of regionally accredited institutions that are not used to having to go through any type of substantive change process for any type of program. Most of them can roll out new programs or new majors or make pretty significant changes to their programming without having to go to their accreditor and go through a substantive change. But certainly they're not used to having to have every single new program that they develop approved through a substantive change process. So that is a considerable burden, and it is a very different and additional burden to what their typical program rollouts would involve. Hybrid programs, CRAC has said, if more than 50% of it's direct assessment, then they essentially treat it under the direct assessment rules. If less than 50% is direct assessment, then it's treated more like just a general CBE program. And that is a generalization. If the details are in the CRAC letter, which, by the way, is one of the letters we're going to circulate along with our paper here following the webinar. So we're going to send that letter to your inbox. The Department of Education, Federal Department of Education, also issued a guidance letter on June 9th, so just a few days later, clarifying its expectations regarding the accreditation of CBE. So the letter was issued to accreditors that are recognized by the Department of Education, and their accreditors were their audience, but obviously it's very informative for institutions as well. It emphasized that accreditors should review and document the sufficiency of the credit hour equivalency. Remember, I mentioned that earlier, and that is if you have a direct assessment program, you've got to show your accreditor how you're essentially translating that direct assessment program back into credit hours, even though it's not built on credit hours. And so one of the accreditor's jobs is to look at that equivalency concept and make sure that it is, I think the phrase the Department of Education used was something like, consistent with standards in higher education. The other thing that accreditors have to do is ensure the regulator that the program involves and really integrated into the design of the program is regular and substantive interaction with qualified faculty. The letter from the department also clarified some of the specific documentation that accreditors have to provide institutions, that those institutions then will have to provide to the feds if they want to get Title for approval of the competency-based ed or direct assessment or hybrid program, and also if they want to participate in the experimental sites initiative that we're going to talk about in a second. So the good news is, this is positive, you've got some new guidance, very recent, just this summer out of the accreditors and the department, and really before that, I mean, there was a whole lot of radio silence. So it's been good to get these official documents out there that are starting to provide some real parameters that schools can latch onto. And my expectation is, you know, we talked about this huge uptick in the number of schools that are looking at CBE. Some of that probably, at least in part, has been propelled by the availability of this guidance, because previously schools were sort of wondering, what are we supposed to do here? And now they've got some parameters in which they can operate, and so it makes it easier to move forward. But there are still some questions out there. How will individual accreditors' processes differ, right? So we've got these very general guidelines from CRAC and from the department, but there's still lots of room for individual accreditors to go about things differently. And those processes could be more or less onerous from one accreditor to the next, and that's certainly of interest to institutions, right? Will the national accreditors adopt the CRAC guidelines, or will they implement processes that are more or less rigorous? Now, I should note, the nationals will have to comply with the Department of Education's guidance if they are recognized by the Department of Education, right? But they are not beholden to the CRAC guidance. And then will the speed and consistency of review processes improve enough to keep up with demand, right? So even though we've got now, you know, a total of 10 pages of guidance, 3 from the accreditors and 6 or 7 from the feds, that's still a long way from a well-oiled machine. And as institutions, you know, as these 600 bring their CBE programs to market and they're trying to get approval through their accreditors, it'll be interesting to see just how much progress the accreditors really have made and their ability, and whether they have experience level and the mechanisms in place to efficiently review all of these programs and again, get them to the next level. Let's talk about Title IV approval of CBE, and I'll move through this pretty quickly because I want to make sure Chris has time. So for a student enrolled in a post-secondary program to receive federal financial aid, the program has to be eligible, right? Student has to be eligible, institution and program also have to be eligible. And historically, competency-based programs tied to credit hour could qualify as eligible, but not direct assessment programs. In 2005, Congress opened the door to the eligibility of direct assessment programs with just a little bit of language, and the little statutory language, and not a lot of guidance for the Department of Education. So in 2006, the department made its first, and to date only, I should point out, effort to implement the new law and promulgated regulations governing how they would go about reviewing and approving direct assessment programs. Rather than create a separate custom regulatory framework, right, the department opted to require institutions, and this is that conversion we were talking about, right, to convert their direct assessment programs back into the credit hour format. So basically, they said, okay, we're going to approve direct assessment programs. You've developed this wonderful program that's built entirely on competencies and the assessment of competencies. It has nothing to do with the credit hour, and now I need you to translate it back to the credit hour and tell me how many credit hours you're going to be giving or would be giving in theory, right? A confusing concept. I give credit to the department for trying to move rapidly to develop some mechanism to get direct assessment programs in through the door, but without a lot of guidance and with requiring institutions to go back and go through this conversion process, you've got a very cumbersome ad hoc approval mechanism. So again, the approach opened the door, which is great, but the case-by-case review required of each proposal, which is still the process that the department's going through even right now, and the lack of certainty surrounding some basic concepts and standards has made for a very frustrating and inefficient application and approval process at the level of the Department of Education. This frustration has been compounded by communication challenges at the bureaucratic level, and I mean among the departments, the political appointees, the policy folks who have spoken out on competency-based ed have been, and Chris will talk about this more, they've really been positive and they're very much in favor of developing CBE, but those aren't the folks who are working with the schools to actually get programs approved, right? You have the staff level folks at the bureaucratic level who are tasked with actually figuring out how to analyze and approve these programs when they come along. And remember, they had very little guidance, none from Congress, and very little even from the department at that point. So just a couple of quotes illustrating this frustration. The president of Middle States described interactions with the department over the first couple of years as incredibly frustrating and leaving her, quote, rather disappointed. And then the Inspector General actually released a final audit report last September, so about a year ago, that substantiated the communication deficiencies and inconsistency between the communication between the department and the accreditors and how the department was reviewing direct assessment programs, and also raised serious questions about how the department was determining whether or not the programs included regular and substantive faculty interaction, which is a legal requirement for direct assessment programs. To be fair, the processes are new and the regulatory hurdles are challenging. So, I don't want to completely throw the department under the bus. They were trying to move quickly in 2006, appreciate the effort, and they've been trying to work things out along the way, right? And they responded to the IAG's report and they said, look, this is new, we're doing the best we can. We got focus groups, we've allocated people to work on this stuff, we're trying to work out these processes, but it's all brand new and it's going to take a little bit of time. Also, resource deficiencies, the department likely played a part. The impression in our conversations and interviews we did with folks when we were preparing our paper, consistently the impression was that it wasn't as if a whole new unit had been hired at the department to do this. It was more like folks who already had jobs were asked to manage competency-based ed, as their night job, so to speak. Obviously, I'm making a little bit of a joke, but the point is there was a real resource deficiency at the department, and that obviously frustrated efforts to get programs approved and to develop policy, things like that. There is good news. So the June letter from the June letters, I should say, from the accreditors and the department suggest improved communication between accreditors and the Department of Ed, so that's good. The experimental sites initiative, specifically for competency-based ed, is underway. Chris is going to talk more about that, I think, but there's news that it's going to be expanded by the end of this year, so that demonstrates a sustained commitment and interest on the part of the department. And substantial new guidance from the department on the experimental sites initiative and more generally on competency-based education is supposedly due out today. We checked right before the session. It has not yet been posted, but they've indicated they're going to be releasing what they call their CBE Experiment Reference Guide, and it's supposed to provide support for both experienced and new CBE providers as they implement this experiment. So the expectation is this is going to be by far the largest and most complete guidance document the department will have put out to date on competency-based education. It's supposed to be posted, they announced it yesterday, it's supposed to be posted at this URL that I've put here at the bottom. When I walked in here, it was not there yet, but it could be there now for all I know. So keep an eye out for that. All of that having been said, though, we wouldn't want to end on a high note. The growth is still going to be slow. I mean, you've got these 600 programs out there. Those aren't all necessarily direct assessment, but the growth of direct assessment and more generally competency-based ed will be slow as long as approval hinges on the current ad hoc process that the department has in place, which requires an individual review of each program, the conversion methodology, SAP, et cetera. And at least until this new guidance document comes out right now, we still don't have a lot of information even about how basic concepts should look. So certainly we think there is great room for improvement. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate it. I also want to send a shout out to so many friends and colleagues and clients I see in the room here. Thank you, everyone, for attending this. I see right at the top Cecilia Rattel from RankU. If anyone online here is running an online program or thinking about running an online program, they should go to RankU or goranku.com. Visit Cecilia and her colleagues. They do an outstanding service. They have new programs up and running with the University of Nebraska and Columbia University. It's a really impressive service. So to take the next step of everything that Aaron just gave you, also my presentation is in a slide heavy, and I'm going to get through this relatively quickly so we can get to questions. Aaron and I came up with some recommendations in our paper that are really overarching. We've pointed out a lot of problems with CBE and how CBE is regulated in the United States. How do we fix the system? How do we move forward here so that it can be deployed more greatly and more deeply? So let me begin here by giving you a quotation from the Carnegie Foundation. So the Carnegie Foundation released a paper on rethinking the credit hour while we were working on our paper for AEI. And our friends over at Carnegie noted, and this is the quotation, "American education has a long history of promising reform ideas that have failed to achieve their intended outcomes. It is one thing to have a good idea for change. It is another entirely to execute effectively and efficiently in our large, complex educational systems." We could not agree more with that sentiment, and we like how succinct it is. You can't help but to get excited about the promise of CBE when undergoing a research project, as Aaron and I have, speaking to some of the leading minds in the field on CBE. But as professionals who have developed our expertise in the regulation of an overregulated industry, we worry that regulation will ultimately stifle and choke innovation, as it seems to almost always do. What most often seems to get missed in education policymaking is meaningful interactions between those in practice and those writing standards. And we expect that chasm may be deepest and darkest in CBE regulation. Earlier this summer, my colleagues and I in the Lobbying and Policy Group here at Thompson Coburn, we had a prominent charter school client conduct a live classroom demonstration on Capitol Hill. And I'm using this example, which included behind the scenes look at a prep session for teachers, because the response was overwhelming on Capitol Hill. Rather than endless hearings by policy experts who all talk to each other, and I include myself there, why don't the experts on the ground interact directly with those writing the law and regulations? Of course, even in the best case and rare scenario when that breakthrough and meaningful interaction does occur between the policymakers and those in practice, you still need the political will to get the hard work of legislating and regulating actually done. So moving to the specifics of our three recommendations, our first of three is review and revise state laws. We begin here by saying that states should review their authorizing statutes with the specific purpose of determining the extent to which those statutes impede competency-based education, and then revise those authorizing statutes accordingly. During that process, any reference to the credit hour should be scrutinized to see if an alternative could be used. In those instances where states determine that the credit hour cannot be jettisoned, legislators should consider granting their postsecondary authorizing agency or agencies within the state the authority to approve direct assessment programming. As Aaron discussed earlier in our state section, many states are actively reviewing and revising their funding formulas for public postsecondary educational institutions. While they might seem to be a little bit afield from competency-based education, those funding formulas can have a direct impact on the growth of CBE programming if the correct levers are pulled, and here's why. In states that are revising their funding formulas for their public post-secondary educational institutions, and when they do so in a manner that is not inconsistent with CBE, we suspect that the public institutions in that state would wage a lot of the battles to revise the accompanying authorizing agency statutes to promote CBE, so that way the funding formula and the authorizing systems are in line with CBE, which would mean that the environment could improve for all institutions in that particular state. Our second of three recommendations is creating a guiding voice for competency-based education. Some higher education thinkers, including many we respect, have proposed an entirely new accreditor for CBE. For CBE to thrive, though, we think a specialized body with expertise in CBE will be necessary. But we propose an independent advisory body, not a separate accreditor, and I'll tell you a couple reasons why. A new accreditor would add yet another entity to the long list of regulators with which post-secondary institutions already contend, and I would argue that we need fewer regulators than more at this juncture of regulation of higher ed in the United States. Rather than creating efficiencies, having a new regulator, a new accreditor, would create another layer of review and approval. Most importantly, a new accreditor would do nothing to help existing institutional and programmatic accreditors make informed decisions about their own review and approval processes of CBE programming. So essentially, you'd be leaving the current system as is and just creating a new accreditor, but you wouldn't be fixing the current system at all. The independent advisory body that Aaron and I proposed would be formed to serve not just institutional and programmatic accreditors, but all post-secondary regulators at large. This would bring a level of consistent expertise to post-secondary regulation and regulators that they could in turn implement on their own. Ultimately, this body could be started to work in the area of CBE, but could actually have a much larger purpose. It could eventually be expanded to provide clear, detailed recommendations to all levels of regulation and oversight on the interaction of innovation and regulation in higher education. And that way, whenever the next system, the next innovation comes that disrupts or changes higher education, just as CBE has, there would be a body in place that could advise all levels of regulation of how you make the changes to their standards so that that innovation can be encouraged rather than rather than creating impediments. Any number of higher education organizations could house this entity, from ACE to CALE to CHIA, to name but a few. We think there are a lot of other agencies out there that could house this entity. And any number of prominent, well-heeled foundations would support it financially. As I began, this entity would build a bridge between practice and regulation, which I really do think is almost always the missing piece in coming up with good quality policymaking and education. And finally, our third recommendation, develop a distinct regulatory scheme for federal financial aid programs. Aaron mentioned, the department moving as quickly as it could to implement its new guidance and regs in 2006. I would argue, and I'm not trying to be snarky here, we're now 10 years past 2006, and the department has barely moved on what it's done with competency-based education. So it just goes to show you how glacial the pace is of change within the Department of Education. But nevertheless, we applaud and support the support that CBE is getting. I'll note that at the Department of Education, that's in the form of the experimental sites and informal sub-regulatory guidance, and in Congress with the proposed competency-based education demonstration programs. Like I said, we're really happy that CBE is getting attention and change is happening. But I would argue that we would argue that both miss the mark because they attempt to further prove what's already proven, rather than changing the regulatory paradigm. We, depending on who you ask, are decades into competency-based education at this point. I don't think we're at a point of demonstration here. I think we're at a point of real implementation. CBE has been around long enough for us to move at long last beyond the pilot phase of its deployment to the next step, which is lasting regulatory reform. Accordingly, we would argue that ED must create a distinct regulatory framework that provides for the review and approval of direct assessment programming without reference to the credit hour or instructional time. And now, Aaron and I realize that we are doing this paper and this exercise in isolation somewhat, and it's a big idea that's a difficult concept to implement in practicality. We've been trying, as higher education I speak, to break ourselves from the credit hour for many decades now, and it has never happened, and it's certainly a huge lift to try to decouple competency-based education direct assessment from the credit hour. But it's essential to the ultimate growth and success of competency-based education to break that connection. We need to move it from a compelling idea to commonplace delivery. With the vast growth of institutions that are interested in higher education, we have to turn that interest into real tangible results by speeding up the process for program approvals and streamlining how that process and those standards work. Beyond the Department of Education, Congress must also take a lead in providing direction and financial support so that the Department of Education can devote the human capital needed for this endeavor to work. Aaron mentioned that our our view is, as was validated by many of the interviews we conducted, that the higher-ups, the political appointees of the Department of Education, are very supportive of competency-based education, but it's when you get down in the weeds, when you talk to the bureaucrats, when they're trying to do their job of implementing the regulations that they're tasked with every day, where the wheels tend to come off the bus and everything seems to slow down. And let me conclude here by saying we were really impressed by the ingenious ways that institutions we spoke with during our interviews, the ways in which they created crosswalks between the credit hour, between their programs and the credit hour, in order to get their CBE programming approved by the Department of Ed. But if the paradigm remains the same as it currently is, when an institution must twist and turn its program into a regulatory pretzel, CBE will never really take off. Those hundreds of programs that are interested in around the country in putting together competency-based programs will never really take off. And also for the Department of Ed, once they solve this problem and they create a more streamlined process, it will also be a lot easier for them to implement this in not just the scale of 5 or 10 institutions, but hundreds or perhaps even thousands of institutions. So that's it for our recommendation section. We'd like to turn it over to some questions, and Aaron is going to curate the questions.
So the first one, Chris, this one's really, I'm going to toss to you, I think. How does CBE fit into the reauthorization conversation? And I assume that means the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act that's happening.
Yeah, so what's interesting, I'll give not too much detail here because I don't want to bore everybody. Congress has been very active in this year, 2015, with the Republican control of the Senate starting in January. Lamar Alexander is the chairman of the Education Committee in the Senate. Patty Murray is the ranking member in the Senate. John Klein of Minnesota is the chairman in the House, with Bobby Scott of Virginia as the ranking member in the House. They have been working feverishly to try to get rid of No Child Left Behind and replace it with a very, very long overdue update to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that's ESEA. That bill has passed both the House and the Senate, and it's pending a conference committee to iron out the differences between the two bills, and I genuinely do think we will see a vastly improved Elementary and Secondary Education Act in this Congress, and somewhat soon, perhaps by the end of the year. Because Senator Alexander does not rest on his laurels, he's been working on HEA reauthorization all throughout this year. His staff and Senator Murray's staff have been working very, very hard together to put together a bill to start the process going forward and move the ball forward to get to a reauthorization, which is due about now. The current authorization expires on September 30th of this year. The next steps to expect would be draft bills from both the House and the Senate, a series of hearings, perhaps then a markup, and then both the House and Senate will pass their bills. Depending on who you ask, this will happen next year or will happen in the years after that. But regardless of that, these bills will last for many, many years. They will be the basis for whatever the next HEA authorization is, whether it's in 2016, 2017, or 2018. What's been very interesting that all four of the leaders here, so the chairman and the ranking members, have done is they've done a lot of work to find the areas of common agreement on their committees so that they can really narrow their focus on areas of disagreement. So last year, before HEA reauthorization was moving, Chairman Klein worked with a bunch of Democrats in the House to do this competency-based education demonstration program that I referenced earlier. That was passed either unanimously or nearly unanimously through the House. That bill was I don't want to say for show, but in essence it was to demonstrate that there were, and there were two other bills that were passed along similar lines to show these common areas between the parties that will definitely get attention in HEA reauthorization. I would expect competency-based education or some version of that demonstration program to be included in HEA reauthorization. However, I do not expect Congress to go nearly as far as Aaron and I would have advocated for, which is, empowering the Department of Ed to really solve this problem once and for all. So that's enough. I can talk inside baseball about Capitol Hill all day long, which is what I do all day long, but I'll leave it at that.
Very good. The next question, and Chris, I'm interested in your thoughts on this too. I'll offer mine. What is the likelihood that FSA, meaning the Department of Education, will ever actually come up with a distinct system for direct assessment? So this is, I'll offer my thoughts quick. I mean, this is crystal ball work, obviously, but I'm optimistic, which is unusual for an attorney, I think, maybe. But I am optimistic. I mean, we've seen some really revolutionary things happen in the last few years, right, in federal student aid. I mean, you saw the birth of direct loan. You saw FFEL go away. There have been some really big developments in the way that things are done. And I think right now, though it's moving at this excruciatingly slow pace, I mean, you have the Experimental Sites Initiative, and I think the department is trying to figure out what makes sense in the way of through the waivers and the letting go of certain elements of satisfactory academic progress or certain elements of the academic term, how they can try to make it work. And I think the end game is not just a series of patches. I mean, I think the end game is to try to come up with a structure, a regulatory infrastructure that is distinct and will work for direct assessment. And I think, I mean, the department, there's a lot of smart folks over there. They have to see the writing on the wall. They see how many programs, they see the kind of political support this idea has. They see the potential for it, meaning, the potential to have a form of education that is high on outcomes and high on deliverables and potentially lower on costs. So it's very favored by some inside the Beltway and at the department. And they've got to know, certainly they know, that the current, ad hoc system of program approval is just not viable for the long term. I mean, they have been struggling to work out the kinks with just 4 or 5 or 6 programs on their table, or on their plate. Now, if you're talking about every year having applications for potentially hundreds of new direct assessment or more generally competency-based ed programs, really we're talking about direct assessment, they've got to come up with a way of approving those programs and for those programs to efficiently draw down and disperse aid, right? I mean, it's just not about the department approving these programs. It's also about how the programs and the financial aid staff at the institutions on an ongoing basis are going to move the money. How do you determine when a student's eligible? When do they get disbursements? How many disbursements do they get? When do the level of disbursements go up? All of those types of things need to be worked out. And I think the momentum is such and the reasons are good enough that I think eventually it will happen. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think eventually it will happen.
I have something to add there.
That's just one man's opinion.
I have something to add there, and this is in a slightly different context, but it really I think could be very, very important. So I was in a couple Hill meetings earlier this week, and we were talking about FSA, federal student aid, in a completely different context. But, as Aaron mentioned, with the switch over from FFEL to direct loans, FSA has been under a lot of pressure for the last several years. It was modified in 1998 to become a performance-based agency, and there's a lot within their purview now. I'm sensing a growing interest during HEA reauthorization to play around with or change either in a small way or in a pretty dramatic way how FSA runs and how it's how oversight of that sub-agency works to make the agency more efficient and more accountable. There's a very high level of frustration on a multiple number of fronts on Capitol Hill when institutions, guarantee agencies, student loan servicers, you name it, are saying that they're having trouble with this, that, or the other with FSA. They're weighing in with their members of Congress, and their members of Congress are not getting the answers that they want from FSA. So I do think that there's a chance in HEA reauthorization that the overall oversight of that sub-agency could change, which could mean some pretty quick and dramatic movement once that happens. You know, if you had a different oversight system, you might say have a board that says you have to implement this direct assessment thing and create a more efficient process, and we're going to require you to do this in the next 12 months. I'm not saying that that's anywhere on the table right now. I think we're talking about just really conceptual phases, but I do think it's possible that in HEA, in HEA and through HEA, FSA might look a little bit different at the end of the game.
Yeah. So we have one more question. Somebody asked, can you provide a list of those states? I'm not 100% sure which list of which states is being referenced, but I can offer a couple of lists. So if you're talking about states that are participating in NC-SARA, remember the reciprocity arrangement? You can go to the NC-SARA, or NSARA, you can go to the NC-SARA website, so you can just Google NC, that's Nancy Cat, NC-SARA, and it'll pop right up, and they actually keep a running, you know, map of the United States and tell you who's now in the reciprocity arrangement, who's not. If you're talking about states that have taken some sort of effort to revise or accommodate direct assessment, you know, when we went through this process of doing our own research, talking with all those folks, we could find no one who had a reliable running tally. Now there is Strategy Labs, which is funded and I think a subunit of the Lumina Foundation, keeps a running competency-based education initiatives tally, and they have a website that's pretty nice. And when we circulate our paper, if you look in the notes in the back, we talk about Strategy Lab and this information, and then we cite to the notes in the back, and there's the HTML is back there too. Okay, so some of the person with the states you referenced before is devoting attention to CBE and a direct assessment. Yeah, I don't think there's anything out there, and I like I said, you can look at the Strategy Lab site, but here's the thing. Most of the sites that you find out there and a lot of these initiatives where they're talking about and tracking in competency-based ed, it's not strictly post-secondary. Competency-based education is also a hot topic and of great interest at the secondary level. And there are actually lots of states, interestingly enough, that have started thinking about how to incorporate competency-based education and direct assessment into their secondary models. So you'll find there are websites and places that talk about states and competency-based ed and who's doing what, but be careful because a lot of those are actually referring to initiatives at the secondary level, not at the post-secondary level. The only state that I know of for sure that has taken some steps is Maryland. They passed some new laws, I think it was earlier this year, that were aimed at accommodating direct assessment programming. And of course, there are a lot of states, like I said, who have made revisions to accommodate specific, either create new institutions or divisions of their public entities that will be doing something with direct assessment. But I know of almost none that have sat down and looked at their general state authorizing laws for private institutions in the state or out-of-state institutions doing, you know, distance ed in their state, and thought about, do we need to make changes here to accommodate programs that aren't tied to the credit hour? I'm aware of no instances of someone looking at their professional licensure requirements. So, you know, all the requirements for folks who want to be, like I said, you know, in public school administration or teachers or for nurses or things like that, and who've made any type of change to accommodate direct assessment. As slow as the movement has been with the department and the accreditors, they are interested and they are making efforts. I've seen very little going on at the state level, unfortunately.
So if you, when you read the paper, there are a couple of good examples of you know, breaking down on some state systems such as New Jersey, Iowa, Virginia. If you have a specific state question, if something's kind of really, you think something's burning in that state or they're doing some work or they're not doing some work, send Aaron a note. We'd love to have a conversation with you about you know, what's going on in that state and dig a little deeper with you.
Yeah, and there may be some data that comes out of the CBE exchange, you know, this conference that's coming up. You know, there are going to be a lot of people who think a lot about this topic, trading ideas, and it'll be interesting to see, and concerned very specifically at the post-secondary environment. It'll be interesting to see what types of reports or publications or papers may come out of that conference as well. And keep an eye out for the department's new guidance. Like I said, it's supposed to be hitting today even, maybe. All right, I think that's it for me, Chris, unless you have anything else to add. And I'll just say thanks to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate you listening.
Yeah, we hope you're not completely asleep, or if you are asleep, we put you to sleep soundly. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate it.
Very good.